You're listening to On Shifting Ground from Commonwealth Club World Affairs and KQED. I'm Ray Suarez. Apart from our year-long series on the 2024 presidential election, we make it a point to focus our attention away from American politics most weeks because the world doesn't revolve around us. But there have been 2 assassination attempts on former President Donald Trump since July, and the world is beginning to question what this recent political violence says about the state of our democracy. But recent assassination attempts were surreal for many. It's been almost a half-century since a U.S. president was shot. But before Ronald Reagan, there was Gerald Ford, John F. Kennedy, and that's just the late 20th century. Attacks on sitting presidents aren't new, but violence on elected officials used to be carried out by individuals with coherent political aims. A lack of clear motivation is about the only attribute linking the 2 Trump shooters, and for Atlantic staff writer Tom Nichols, the deranged mental health of the would-be assassins speaks to today's strain of political violence. Since the latest attempt on Trump, Nichols has published 2 articles, one on the legacy of American presidential assassinations, the second on how Donald Trump is using this recent violence for political gain. And he joins me now to break down why this era is so different from the attacks on Ronald Reagan and Gerald Ford half a century ago. Tom Nichols, welcome back to On Shifting Ground.
Thanks, Ray. Thanks for having me back.
Well, for years, Americans have been telling public opinion researchers they believe violence is justified to change the political trajectory of the country. When you know that, is this moment a little less aberrant?
No, this moment is super aberrant because there have always been people that are willing to use violence throughout the history of our country. And this isn't even in our lifetimes, even in the modern era, not the first time. I mean, we went through a period of left-wing violence in the 1970s. It's easy to memory hole how bad it was, but there were bombing campaigns. What's different is how many Americans in what we would think of as sort of the stratum of ordinary folks who were usually appalled by such things now are dividing up and saying, well, I could countenance violence if I really thought it was necessary. And I think in part that's a period of having lived so long without that kind of social turmoil. I almost want to say it's the same way that wars begin, because people forget how bad they are.
It's almost like a luxury, born out of the fact that it has been relatively peaceful. But the more you widen out the picture, the frame, hasn't political violence been a constant in our 200-plus years as a republic?
I would widen that frame even further and say political violence is a constant in all democracies, because democracy is about compromise, and sometimes people lose. And sometimes people who lose arguments in democracies don't accept that they've lost an argument in democracy, and they resort to violence. And we're seeing that now. We have the new era of violence is right-wing violence. People just don't like the way the country's going. They can't accept that in a democracy, these choices are mediated by elections and local and state and federal decisions, and they've decided to resort to violence. But I think that's cyclical and common in democracies. You know, authoritarian states are very peaceful places by design because there is only one source of violence in the society, and that is always the government. But in a democracy, especially in an open society, it's hard to tamp down violence because we live openly. We don't live in compounds and camps. So I think it's unfortunately, it's part of living in a democracy.
The 2 Trump incidents have been a spur to bring up the mid-'70s and the 2 attempts on Gerald Ford's life. Political violence trivia buffs may suddenly be mentioning Squeaky Fromme and Sarah Jane Moore, who, I checked, remarkably, they're both still alive. I try to think about what made Gerald Ford a legit target And it's really hard. He didn't use violent rhetoric. He was bringing the remaining troops home from Vietnam. He never would have said, punch that guy in the face and I'll pay the legal charges. The undertone of violence, the horror of it, was very much present. Did that make it more shocking? And did that contribute to the fact that today's presidents for decades now can't live a normal life?
I mean, I don't mean to laugh, but it is almost out of like a bad movie that like one of the last unjailed members of the Manson family goes after the unelected, almost temporary president of the United States, who is also just like the nicest guy in the world. It's just so bizarre. But I think particularly of the Ford assassinations as like the last act or the epilogue of the 1960s. And I think that's one of the things that made it scary at the time, because the Manson murders took place. Think about how our time horizons have changed. When Squeaky Fromm went after Gerald Ford, it had only been 6 years since the murders and only a few years since Manson had been locked up for life. They were all supposed to be on death row, and that was commuted because of the Supreme Court decision. Sarah Jane Moore was obsessed with Vietnam. Well, in 1975, that was the first year that there were no longer any American combat troops in Vietnam. That's how recent Vietnam was. And she really believed that killing Ford, I don't know how you come to this belief about killing Gerald Ford, but that if she killed Ford, there would be a revolution, that it would spark a wave of revolutionary violence. I think what's different, and that made it terrifying, right? Because I think a lot of people, I was in high school at the time, and I was like, wow, those Manson people are like still around and free? Like, how did that happen? But I think what's more unsettling today is that I think that the people like the guys who've gone after Trump, they're more like school shooters or the random kind of mass killers who walk into a church or a mall or a school than they are the politically motivated assassins of 50 or 60 years ago. And I think that's even in some way scarier because the president becomes the target simply by being famous enough to be worth killing.
Which also carries through into early 1981, when John Hinckley actually hits Ronald Reagan by opening fire, grievously injuring other people on the scene as well. Unlike this guy recently arrested in Florida, he actually opened fire. He hit the president. Ronald Reagan would have been dead a handful of weeks into his presidency.
Yeah, it is amazing that what we now know, that Reagan nearly died, and it would have changed history forever. And why? Because this unstable, emotionally messed up guy wanted to impress an actress. And I think this is the thing people have a hard time coming to grips with in the past few months about the guys that shot at, or were at least one of whom was shot at Trump, is that a lot of these threats, because every president has threats. This is not, these two guys got closer to Trump than they should have, but every president and every presidential candidate gets threats. That just goes with the territory now. But this lack of a political context, people want to believe there's a reason because randomness is terrifying. But we'll never know what this kid in Pennsylvania was thinking. But we do know that he was researching Biden. That from what they could tell by deconstructing his phone, he was going to shoot at the first famous guy, first president that got near him.
Given what you just said, it's particularly interesting to watch how political Republicans, elected officials, party people have used these two Trump incidents in recent days. After Donald Trump was wounded in Pennsylvania, after the aspiring Florida assassin was arrested, Republicans en masse began blaming Democrats for the violence against the former president because of the violence of Democratic political rhetoric.
Yeah, it's ridiculous. First of all, no one uses more violent rhetoric than Donald Trump. I mean, he is far and away the champion and leader when it comes to talking about hurting other Americans and I think in a way, the Republicans are reacting so strongly to this almost as a way of deflecting and to draw attention away from Trump. And they're trying to put content into these shooters where there really isn't any. And when you look back, what made, again, to raise Gerald Ford, and one of the things that made him such a decent man, especially with Sarah Jane Moore, he could have said, look at what the liberals and their hatred of Nixon and the Vietnam War and of Republicans, look, this almost got me killed, you people. And instead, he just didn't do it. Reagan barely talked about it. 2 or 3 paragraphs in an address before Congress about economics. And then he said, now let's talk about inflation. Never tried to pin the blame on anybody for that. And I think that's leadership. And it's also guys who know that the world is full of unstable people who are going to try and take shots at famous people. The last time you saw something like this, where the arguments between the right and the left over whether Lee Harvey Oswald was a communist or a right-winger. And the truth is, he was both. He was neither. He was a troubled weirdo who, if he hadn't gotten to Kennedy, had thought about killing General Edwin Walker, who was actually a very right-wing American political figure at the time. And I think one of the things people have to grapple with now is that the most common kind of assassin out there is that lone wolf who says, I don't care who it is, but I'm going to be famous. You look at the guy who shot Wallace, Arthur Bremer, same thing. I'm going to be famous. My name will be remembered. And I think that it's almost quaint now to think of Abraham Lincoln being the last act of the Civil War, or McKinley being shot by an actual, no kidding, anarchist. It's almost like, wow, that's like vintage assassins, who once had political goals. And I think those days are over.
These crimes do change the course of history, though. Who knows? America could have been different. If John F. Kennedy ran for re-election in 1964, these are real hinge points. And certainly, it's amazing to consider how the 60s might have been different.
I think that's one reason there's so much fascination with conspiracies around Kennedy, in the same way that I think you're seeing now, like Trump's people trying to talk about deep state conspiracies and why was the shooter on the roof and so on. Because it's very hard to accept that this charismatic figure, Jack Kennedy, right, just blown away in a car next to his wife. And people look at that and they say, there has to be some bigger reason. It can't just be because this weirdo, Oswald, somehow managed to get up in the depository and was a good shot because he'd been trained in the Marines. It can't be. And you saw it with 9/11. It can't be that 19 guys with box cutters did this. It has to be bigger than that, because people's minds have a hard time getting around that. It sounds like you're minimizing it, right? When Trump was wounded, as you say, the would-be assassin drew blood from a former president. People said, well, this has to be a bit, well, no, or bear with us here. It could be a mentally disturbed young man in a country where assault-type weapons are just too easy to get and got through a hole in the Secret Service's preparations. But people have a hard time with that because that's really scary.
I was thinking a lot about American exceptionalism because a Swedish prime minister has been murdered out in public, a French prime minister. In the 1990s, the leading candidate for president of Mexico was gunned down at a rally. There were 4 pretty serious attempts on the life of Queen Victoria. This is not unheard of in the history of human events. But when this kind of thing happens, people in other countries think of it as an American experience because we are assumed to have an undertone of violence in our lives, much higher rate of deaths from gunfire, much higher rate than other countries in the developed world of murders. Should this be a moment where we think about the role violence plays in our society in writ large kind of way?
I think that's unfair. I think when these things happen overseas, people say, well, this is the American disease. We're catching that American assassination virus. But as you pointed out, Queen Victoria, again, in any open society, you run the risk of running into people that are just disordered and unhappy and miserable and can get a gun. And I would even argue that while America as a country is much more violent, political violence is actually more common in most other countries, in the sense of, attacks on political leaders, people in government. It's pretty rare. The thing is that the Americans pioneered the institution of the presidency, which really does focus people on one national leader in the way that in other countries they would have been focused on a king or a queen. I think it's a little unfair to talk about it as strictly an American problem. We're also just a much bigger country in that sense, and I think we have a little more of everything. But I think that the personality types that emerge in the modern era are largely the same, which is these are not usually political plots. I mean, the last time you really saw a plot like that in the United States, I would argue, is probably the two Puerto Rican nationalists who tried to kill Truman. That was an assassination plot rooted in a clear political objective carried out by multiple assassins.
And a coordinated attack that also included opening fire in the House of Representatives and
Yes.
wounding congressmen standing on the floor. And there, yes, with strong political motivation, but also an expectation that there was no way they were going to get away with it. They saw themselves as sacrificial lambs. Lolita Lebron was famously asked why she did it, and she was disappointed. She said, "I didn't come to kill them. I came to die for Puerto Rico." And that didn't happen. She lived to be a very old woman.
Terrorists they called that the propaganda of the deed. That you didn't really care about surviving, that the thing you were doing was so shocking that it carried your message forward in and of itself, long after you were gone. But I just don't think that's what we're looking at now.
I want to talk a little bit about propriety, because a lot of what goes on at this level, at the highest level of our national political life, is sort of a set of Arthur Murray footprints on the floor, things you do while other people watch you do them. And when there is a moment where sort of time is ruptured and things go off the tracks, everybody returns to normal by doing the things that propriety demands. But we aren't really that place anymore, are we? Once you've got leading members of one party saying that the real perpetrators are the people who criticize our guy, they are not showing any particular desire to reestablish the equilibrium by saying the Arthur Murray dance floor steps things that you do in order to get things back to normal.
Yeah, other presidents who have dealt with plots like this, they have thought that their responsibility is to calm the public and to return things to normal and to get on with the business of governing and to assure people that their government still functions, that, everybody in Washington is getting along, that everybody deplores this kind of violence. The reality is that one American political party has become a cult of personality, and they echo whatever the leader of that cult of personality says. And of course, for Donald Trump, let me say one good word about Donald Trump and all this, which is that after the first attempt on his life, he really didn't go down that road. He gave this very self-indulgent, meandering, kind of maudlin, long explication of what happened to him at the Republican convention, which I guess counted as his acceptance speech for the nomination. But that's his choice. Let us at least say that at that moment, Trump, who thought he was winning and was headed back to the presidency, really didn't try to do that thing where, it's like because of my many enemies and so on. This time around, Trump just has, in the way that I think he has been melting down on so many things, especially since the debate, just went right there. And his vice president, who I think has just made this ghastly statement to my colleague at The Atlantic, David Frum, where he said, "Two people from your team," as if we are all part of this vast conspiracy, which was really despicable. But that is following Trump's lead. And I think, at this point, this is not just a cult of personality, but it's driven by a kind of abstract will to power. And so saying whatever you need to say, the goal is not really to look after America, take care of its people, reassure the citizens when something scary like this happens. Everything is the raw material for the acquisition of power. And I think that's really unfortunate. That puts us in a terrible place as a nation. But unfortunately, that's where we are, because propriety, and I think it's so right of you to bring that up, Ray. Propriety, at least for a lot of these folks, is really out the window now. It's about what serves their interests rather than what serves the country or what restores some sense of civic virtue and balance.
Looking back to January 6, 2021, that was an act of mass political violence. And maybe not everybody in the crowd, but certainly the people who were the catalysts for what happened at the Capitol had a distinct political agenda. It was very clear what they were up to. I was there that day. I saw these guys in Army Navy surplus military cosplay in their thousands. They were amping each other up, encouraging each other to more and more violent flights of rhetoric. And it was no surprise at all, in one sense, what went on after that. Did that open up a seam that creates different expectations, creates different things that we have to be looking out for in the aftermath of this coming November 5th?
Absolutely. It was, in my view, a seditious insurrection. It was instigated and cheered on by the President of the United States. It was probably one of the darkest days in our history. I mean, I agree with George Will, who said it should be burned into our hearts the way 9/11 was. It's the first failed peaceful transfer of power in American history. I spent a lot of time studying the Soviet Union and Russia, and I used to go to Moscow and Petersburg all the time and talk with Russians. I would brag about it. Look, the way you get to be a democracy is you can hand power back and forth, without killing each other. And I can't say that now. I can't say that in 250 years, we've always managed to do that. And we didn't make it this time. And it was, as you say, a distinctly political movement. We're going to kill the vice president. We're going to disband Congress. We're going to stop the vote. We're going to install a different president. That is as nakedly political as it gets. Now, the people in the crowd, many of whom I think were, again, lost and swept up in the emotion and all of that. But there were people in there who are now doing time. I mean, imagine that we live in the 21st century and there are people who have been convicted for seditious conspiracy, which is really something to consider. Let me try and be a little positive about this as well. I think January 6th was a real shock to the system for a lot of people. And I think sending hundreds of those people to jail has had a real kind of clearing of the mind for a lot of other folks. Remember, at the beginning of this conversation, we were saying it's really easy to talk about this in the abstract and say, sure, I'd support violence. Well, if suddenly you're doing 5 years for it, you've got a lot of time to think about whether it was worth it. And if you're not in jail and you're seeing that guy, you're saying, when I said that, do I really want to be doing 5 years or 8 years or 12 years in a federal prison simply because I spent too much time on the internet? And I think that in a strange way, it has made things worse and better, if that makes any sense.
Well, there's no small fraction of the American public that exalts some of these people as heroes, thinks it was distinctly unjust that any of them have been convicted of crimes, that they are doing time. They will say quite publicly and repeatedly that these people have been disproportionately prosecuted, given stretches that don't in any way match the magnitude of their crime. So there are out there among us a significant number of people who are willing to go along with the idea that this is all being blown out of proportion and that it wasn't really that violent, which is almost a more disturbing thing. We've seen what happened that day, but there's a lot of people, including elected officials, who are willing to go to bat for those people as tourists who got a little out of hand.
Yes, the elected officials who are doing that are the worst of all, because again, they know better, and people next to them that they work with every day could have been killed. But I think that it's interesting that Trump does this whole business of their heroes and I'm going to look at pardoning them and so on. But yet when Trump has tried to call out crowds on his behalf over the past few years, people haven't shown up. It's been interesting to say, in theory, that was a great idea, but now we're up to something like, I think the last number I saw is something like 900 people have been convicted. Several hundred have gone to jail. Some of them got really long stretches. Again, it's that thing to say, was that really worth it? And I think especially for a lot of people who did this and then were kind of amazed, like, I could be arrested for this? The fact that there were consequences from this, and there are now thousands of families across this country that have been affected by this, maybe that's a good thing. Maybe it took it out of the realm of hypotheticals for a day. With all that said, I have to answer your question honestly, Ryan. I think, yeah, especially if Trump loses, there's going to be violence because he seems to have no compunction about priming people up to believe that, yet again, any election he loses is by definition a rigged and fraudulent election, which I think is just, it's a real attack on our system and on the rule of law and our democracy.
It sounds like what you're saying is we could have trouble either way. If he loses, we're going to have tumult that follows his inability to accept the loss. If he wins, this kind of rhetoric and this kind of violence will be rooted in our system in a way that should disturb us.
Yes, encouraged in our system by the chief executive, by the commander in chief. And the rest of us will not be protected by a Justice Department that would prosecute this because it will be his Justice Department. I think Americans really haven't thought through what happens when the rule of law becomes secondary to the personal needs of a wannabe authoritarian. Remember that famous comment by a Latin American dictator who said, "For my friends, everything. For my enemies, the law." Where the law will simply become whatever the president wants it to be at any given moment. And it won't be an instrument of justice for the United States. It will simply serve the goals of one man.
Tom Nichols is the author of Our Own Worst Enemy, The Assault from Within on Modern Democracy. He's a staff writer at The Atlantic. Thanks for joining us on Shifting Ground.
It's good to be with you, Ray.
You've been listening to On Shifting Ground, produced in partnership with KQED, with funding from listeners like you. Today's episode was produced, mixed, and mastered by Matteo Schimpf. Additional production and engineering were provided by Rob Spate. KQED's Jim Bennett is our technical supervisor. Jared Spord is our executive producer. Philip Yun is co-CEO of Commonwealth Club World Affairs. Our music is from Blue Dot Sessions. I'm Ray Suarez. Thanks for listening.